Welcome to TICE News. So we have with us today Giulia, who was one of the draft policy makers in the Communiqué that was published today. Hi Giulia, welcome to TICE News. So can you please tell our audience how were you associated with the Communiqué policy and what was your role in it?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. I'm Giulia Ajmone Marsan from the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, based in Jakarta, Indonesia, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Inclusion Task Force of Startup20. So, as a member of the task force, together with my fellow task force members, we drafted together the Policy Communiqué under the leadership of India. It was very interactive and a very inclusive process.
Okay, so you mentioned that you helped with the other task force members to draft this policy. This communique that has been drafted, how do you see it impacting the startup ecosystem in India? What will be its impact?
Well, I think this communique will not only impact the startup ecosystem in India, but throughout the entire G20 countries.
Okay.
I think this was a very interesting communique because it's the first time that there's an engagement group from the G20 that is entirely dedicated to startups and innovation.
True.
So it's the first communique bringing the points of view of the startup community and about innovation ecosystems to G20 leaders. So it's a very important first step.
You mentioned that this Startup20 Initiative under India's G20 presidency is a first. So do you think that the next presidency is with Brazil? So do you think that going forward, the other countries which will be holding the G20 presidency, they should also come up with such initiatives?
Yeah, I think from what we understood today that they already agreed to continue, and I think we will see a kind of scaling up of Startup20, not only continuing the initiative, but becoming bigger and bigger to include even more people and becoming some of these very, very important G20 initiatives that year after year are contributing to the policy for innovation and startups globally.
Okay, so you mentioned that you were researching in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Jakarta. So how do you see, what is the difference between the startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia and India?
I see differences, but I see also a lot of similarities. Of course, India and Indonesia are two different countries with different traditions, different cultures. And innovation is a phenomenon that is always locally driven. Startups, they typically want to find solutions to problems that are happening in a certain place, in a certain ecosystem. They adapt to different regulation and rules. But there are also a lot of similarities. India is a leader, like Indonesia and Southeast Asia is, for instance, when it comes to digital payment, fintech, digital solutions. I was actually very impressed when I was in Goa for one of the previous meetings. I was with someone from the Startup20 team. We bought a coconut water on the beach. And what did we do? We paid with our app because there was a QR code, and that was so good. And this is something that is, for instance, these kind of innovations are also taking place in Southeast Asia. Many Southeast Asian countries are actually ahead. They're using digital technologies for payments at a much higher degree than in places like North America or Europe, for instance. So these are very, very interesting developments that we should continue to monitor and learn from. So
you mentioned that you are a researcher in Indonesia. What do you think is the future like for startup ecosystem throughout the world? Because there is a funding winter, as we call it, because of the SVB bank collapse in America. So how do you see the future of startups in the coming time?
It's true that it's a funding winter, although some of the trends associated to this winter, as you call it, it's also due to an overarching macroeconomic framework. It's not necessarily just related to innovation or less innovation potential. I think that this is a time for startups to show and demonstrate their value added by becoming even more innovative, developing sound plans to submit and pitch to investors. But this is also the reason why perhaps this group has the potential to become so important, because in times where perhaps startups are struggling a little bit, what do they need? They need access to global networks. And this is what Startup20 is providing, because it's a global network of ecosystem builders.
So you mentioned that since this funding winter is happening and the startups need to connect with other startups globally to thrive, and as a startup founder, when I am looking to start a startup, most of people think that if you have a startup idea and you think it is scalable, then it's a foolproof startup plan for us. But how important is economics part in it? Because it is somehow overlooked, or people do not understand the importance of being a proper economist, clearing the economics part of a startup. So what are your suggestions for a startup founder who is looking to start a startup? So what parts of economics should he be able to understand if a startup founder is going to start his own startup?
Well, I mean, startup founders, they need to have an idea of how to solve a problem. Typically, it's what their business model is about. But clearly, they also need to have an idea of where the market is going. And this is where, economics comes into the picture. So you need to know a little bit, who's my target customer, the solutions, in which countries do I want to operate, what are the emerging market niches, what are the ones that perhaps are a little bit less ideal. So obviously, I mean, this kind of framework conditions are very important for any startup founder. But let me come back to something that you asked me just at the beginning of the question. You said that it's very important to connect startup with startups. This is true, but it's also very important to connect globally startups with other key players of the ecosystem. I mean, the academia, think about universities and the role they play, I mean, in innovation, but also funders from different locations and places. And this is what, all different task forces of Startup20 try to do. And this is what probably, I think we will see even more surprises next year from Brazil.
Just to sum up, how was your experience working with the Startup Engagement Group in India? And how was your experience coming to India? And what do you perceive of this Startup20 event?
It was a very exciting journey, and I think there was a lot of excitement because it was a new thing.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of innovation within the group itself because the general chair, Dr. Chintan, and the knowledge team and the different organization in India and elsewhere, we had to understand how to work together, learn what could work well and could work a little bit less well. But this is why, in a sense, the journey was so interesting and exciting because it was so new.
So my last question to you is, how do you see India as a player in the startup global ecosystem? Because it is now emerging, it is the first country which has taken this Startup20 initiative under the G20 presidency. So how important do you think will India's role be in the coming years in the global startup ecosystem?
Well, on one hand, the fact that India, while hosting the presidency of G20, decided to create Startup20, this already demonstrates the fact that the Indian government plays a lot of, devotes attention and importance to the topic of startups and business creation itself, which is something very interesting, of course. But on the other hand, we are already seeing it. I mean, India is this very big emerging country with lots of innovation happening, where, you have lots of fintech solutions and other forms of entrepreneurship. I think India is also paying a lot of attention to innovation for inclusion, which is something that we looked into in my task force. So we looked a lot at, women entrepreneurship, but also how technology could become a channel for inclusion of people with disability and, other type of underrepresented groups. So I think that India will become increasingly a key player in the global innovation ecosystem in the years to come, because it's such a big country, because it's growing very fast, because you have a lot of young, educated population. So I think we can expect a lot of surprises.
Thank you, Julia, for coming on TICE News and sharing your insights. Thank you a lot.
Thank you for having me.